He's Howard Ibach, former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we have, I guess we'd call her a pioneer of strategy account planning, joining us today. Her name is Robin Hafitz. She'll tell us her story. Let's join the conversation. Henry, we're back with another episode, and I'm delighted to welcome to our stage, our show, a woman I met at an offsite training for HSS Enterprises in Toronto a couple of weeks ago. I was invited to do a talk, and she was invited to do a talk on strategy. Her name is Robin Hafitz. She is a founding partner of Mad Dogs and Englishmen. We're going to talk about that in a bit. She has her own consulting business right now. It's called Open Minds, and I'm happy to wear her t-shirt. Robin, it's good to see you again, and welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Great to see you, Henry, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. Sorry, great to see you, Howard, and such a pleasure to meet you, Henry. Yeah.
Well, we are fascinated to have with us today someone who goes back, about as far as we do. A veteran in the business, and who, when I met you in Toronto, you shared with me some really fascinating information about your contributions to account planning, which now we call strategy. And we want to talk about that, but we'd like to ask our guests to give us a little background about how they found their way to the business. It's a fascinating thing that so many of our guests have in common, that it's not always a direct path. It's often circuitous. So we'd like to hear how you found your way to advertising and strategy, and a little bit about your career.
Sure. It was a bit circuitous. I was a creative nerd. So I was an artist, and I thought that what I would want to do with my life would be to make art. But I was also a nerd, which meant that I got a free ride at Yale to go be an Ivy Leaguer. So I was a Yale artist. I was taking art as my major, but you don't really get into Yale because you're a good artist as an undergrad. You get into Yale because you're a good student when you're an undergrad, because you have good test scores, that sort of thing. And so as a creative nerd, I very, very much enjoyed my college time. When I came out, I thought, okay, I'm going to paint. And I sat in front of my canvases, and what by meaning I'm going to paint, what that really meant was I'm going to waitress. And I was waitressing in New York City, and I was a damn good waitress, I will say. It took me a long time to make as much money as I did as a waitress. But I was sitting in front of my canvases, and I kind of realized that the people I knew, my classmates who were really having some success, at least in moving forward as artists, were sort of monomaniacs about something. And I didn't really have the thing that I thought I needed to be a monomaniac about. And so I started to think, I've got to actually get a job. So I was already going to the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and I was going in just to do figure drawing, just to keep my hand in and create images and, draw from life. But they had a class on advertising, and I thought, oh, maybe I could be an art director. So I took the class on art directing, and on advertising. I got paired with a man who was a writer, and was like, okay, we're going to put a book together because we're both looking for, work. And we started putting ads together. We did. But I realized then that, wait a minute, I'm not the kind of artist that would be a good art director. I'm too messy. I'm not really a design kind of minded person as much as I was an art minded person. And so I sort of switched over to writing and started putting that book together. And I met a dear friend of the guy who had been my partner. So now we were two writers partnering to put a book together. And that guy had a small agency. I met him because I served him in a restaurant. As a waitress.
Waitressing paid off.
Waitressing paid off. It did. His name is Jeff DeJoseph. And he had started an agency with one other guy, a guy named Rick Albert. They were a two-person agency. I didn't know it at the time, but Jeff was one of the first planners who was doing planning in America as an American. And the reason he was doing that was because he'd set off to start this agency after leaving Chiat Day, and being trained by Jane Newman. And so when I settled into this agency, I swept the floor and I opened the place in the morning and I closed it at night. I was the one employee for a good long while. And then I wasn't. But we grew. But I also started getting the opportunity to uh be the person who started to think about what the advertising would be about. Because Jeff, although he'd been trained as a planner, he really wanted to be, more of he wanted to be a writer. And so he was doing most of the writing. And so I started both thinking about what the advertising would be about and also being the person who did research. And at this point in my life, my research and strategy company, Open Mind Strategy, LLC, at this point in my life, I've probably done tens of thousands of focus groups personally. I've done a lot of talking to consumers. So I fell into this role of being sort of a pocket planner in this tiny little agency. And then Jeff got asked by what was at the time Dick Lord's agency that was doing the IBM advertising with the Charlie Chaplin thing, The Little Tramp. Jeff got asked to come in and start a planning department. And I was the planning department. And then Dick Lord, I think he didn't like his Christmas bonus. So he and some partners set off to start another agency called Lord Geller Federico Einstein. And I was, again, the planning department. And one thing I learned at LGFE was the degree to which the planning department was also a really, really important part of the pitching department. So, as a strategist, you try to think about what the advertising is going to be about and figure that out. But honestly, you also figure out what is the story that we are going to tell that is going to make us feel like the right agency for this client. So I did a lot of that.
Let me just interrupt because I want to ask a question about you. You
Sure.
said you've done tens of thousands of focus groups,
At
and you
least.
kind of you've evolved from first kind of a non-art director in the sense that you were more artist than art director. So you switched to copy, and then you found your way to strategy. Where did you cut your teeth? How did you acquire what you thought you needed to
Well, I mean,
be a
experience.
strategist?
I mean, experience. I mean, certainly, Jeff was teaching me, and he'd learned at Jane's knee. And after LGFE, where I went was actually to Shy Day, where I worked with Jane for the first time. And Jane Newman, mother of planning in America. Although when she got on the plane, she was an account person. When she got off the plane, she was a planner. Not everybody knows that. But she was exactly, of course, what Jay Shyatt was looking for. So how I learned, I mean, Jeff taught me, but also, again, being a nerd, being a creative nerd, right? That's me. I'm a creative nerd. A nerd goes out and finds out information. A nerd goes out and finds out what people are actually buying. Even if we don't have primary research that is being funded, there's always secondary research that one kind of digs into. A nerd, if you're doing something for a product, you go and you see what it looks like in the store if you can. So as a nerd, I would gather information, and then as a creative person, I would try to make a leap to simplifying a message. And I would work with whoever was the creative group that I was working with. In the case of Jeff DeJoseph, he was my boss. Later that wasn't the case. Later we had more people, and that was not the case at LGFE. There was a creative department. I would talk to those people about what they were thinking, so that I would know not to give them something that they wouldn't be excited by, right? I would usually give them something different than what they might have thought of, but I knew not to give them something they wouldn't be excited by. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that probably is a strength of having come from, at least initially, been on the creative side, right? Is you kind of you understand the challenge of a creative person, like to sit down with a blank piece of paper and a problem. As a strategist that has that background, you kind of
Yeah.
know what they need intuitively. or ideally you would, right? Like I'm sure there are bad strategists out there that don't do that, but I definitely, I've always felt until you sit down and try to solve the creative problem
Uh-huh.
yourself, it's you know, you don't really know what a creative needs in terms of inspiration and information in a brief.
I would probably agree with that. And I would also say something, and I said this, I think you heard me say it, Howard, when we were in Toronto together. You know, creatives get this sort of this wonderful adjective, which the rest of the people in the agency world don't get. But I just want to say to those listening who are, for instance, strategists, or for that matter, account people, you should feel free to call yourselves the intelligents and the responsibles.
Yeah, I like that. Yes. Well, we are spoiled and we're a little protective about, being creatives. And
Mhm.
I learned very quickly that no one has a monopoly on creativity.
Absolutely not.
Everybody has an avenue into some kind of an idea, and to be protective about that is just, it's silly.
And it's
So
also, I mean, it's also, when when I worked actually, come to think of it, yeah, I did a little moment as a secretary between waitressing gigs in a group that was also, there was a startup of some guys who'd been around for a good long while. And I would talk about meeting with the creatives and needing to do things for the creatives. And my mother would say, "But that's you, Robin." She was just, I mean, and by the way, it's my mother's art that's behind me right now. But it's like we all have elements.
well, I have told this story many times and I won't retell it. Henry's heard me talk about the story called the Capodastro bar. Have you heard that story?
What's the
Oh,
capo?
Now
well,
you gotta now you gotta say it.
I gotta tell it. Yeah. Well,
I know you
because
gotta tell it. Yeah.
you sound like the classic person who would have done this. The Capodastro bar is I don't know if it's apocryphal, but it's been around for a long time. It's a story about an agency who lands a new account. It's a piano manufacturing company, and the copywriter assigned to the project is dissatisfied with the information that he's received from the marketing people who come to the agency. And he asks his creative director, "Can I go to the plant and poke around?" And it's a bus right away. So he says, sure. He goes to the plant and he gets the tour and he still isn't satisfied. When he looks down on the manufacturing floor where all the dust and the wood and everything is being used to make a piano, and he sees this old guy. He says, "Can I talk to that guy?" And he said, sure. He's been here since, the 19th century. And he says, "I'm looking for something that can just help me distinguish this product from all the other piano makers." And the guy says, "Well, have you heard about the Capodastro bar?" I says, "No, tell me." It's essentially a piece of wood, and this is a real story. This is, at least I think it is. It's a piece of wood inserted into the piano that will not do anything until about 50 years after the piano's been made, because there's another piece of wood that it supports that will start to warp. And there's nothing we can do about it. The piece of wood is going to warp, and the Capodastro bar is designed to prevent it from warping so it doesn't change the shape and the tautness of the wires that are used to make the music of the piano. So when we make this piano, it'll last you for at least 50 years or more. And so many of the major opera houses and orchestras, etc., buy our piano because it will last a very long time. And the copywriter said, "I've got my hook. I know
Yeah.
I know how to sell this product now." So the point of it is the creative nerd like you and so many others doesn't accept what the marketers and the salespeople and everybody else tell him or her. They dig deeper. They want to know. And it's a way of saying that there's no such thing as a parody product. I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as a Capodastro bar for Pepsi or Coke. That's going to be a
Right.
branding
Right.
issue. But for a piece of equipment as multi pronged as with as many moving parts as a piano, there could be something, and he found it. That's the
But
story of the
but
Capodastro bar.
even the story of the Capodastro bar, it's not about the Capodastro bar, right? It's about what it
No,
says about the company, that they would think ahead, that they're building something for the long term, that it's not this like there's a lot of places you can launch off from the very kind of practical physical nature of that, component of the piano, and that ultimately can formulate the DNA of the brand and the advertising that could go in a million different directions. So I
But
think with
for
Coke and
me,
Pepsi, there might be something in their history, something
yeah.
in their DNA that could become that figuratively.
But for me, the major point is the creatives involved in selling the product didn't accept just the stuff that was handed to them by the marketing. They did a little digging.
Right,
They were
right.
intrepid. And that's
Yeah.
and when you say that you were a nerd, that you didn't accept what your answer, you wanted to dig deeper. It's like we're fellow travelers. I get it. I hear what you're saying. And that's why I thought of the Capodastra bar as a story.
And it's also, I mean, you know, there's most advertising is terrible, right? I mean, most of it is mostly awful. It certainly hasn't gotten better in recent years. It's gotten smaller, you know, it's littler pieces, but for the most part. Um, but a lot of people who work for the company, a lot of marketing folks, sort of they start with claims, you know. Um, and that might be right, but it often isn't. You know what I mean? It just often isn't. The thing I'm usually looking for from a strategy perspective, I'm looking for an insight, and that insight might be the Capodastra bar, but it might be the people who buy our piano are a bit different than everybody else, right? It might be about the audience, or very often it's getting really, really clear about what the advertising needs to do. You know, because not all advertising needs to do the same thing, right? You know, I mean, you could say it's always about selling more stuff, but do you need to steal share or do you need to protect share? You know, those are going to, for me, lead to two quite different briefs, for instance. So I often find that for me, sometimes the sexiest place in the brief is actually the objective.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't, from all the folks we've had on to talk about the brief, you're the first to talk about the objective in that fashion.
But had you dug a little deeper with John Steele, that's what's sexy about Got Milk. It's the objective. Because what, you know, Got Milk versus all the other milk advertising, including the milk advertising that came afterward, the milk mustache, is all just about happy, sexy people drinking milk. You know, it's just like treating milk like a fashion brand or something. You know, ooh, look, you know, celebrities drink milk. But Got Milk is about remind yourself on your way home, do you actually have that stuff? Because you're gonna need it. Right. So that objective, the objective of interrupting, you know, before the purchasing occasion to say, wait a minute, do I have that thing is very different than I'm trying to change the idea of milk from being something that is sort of, you know, just for kids to being something that is, you know, consumed by, you know, swimsuit models. Different, you know, it's actually what's sexy there is the objective, that insight.
I've always
Interesting.
felt, I've always felt that there's no predicting what part of the brief is actually going to be the one that's going to set off the
Huh.
creative spark. Like, yeah, and so it might be what you wrote as a strategist, as the insight. It might be what you wrote as the single-minded proposition. As you said, it could be what you wrote in the objective. It's like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking. And so I think as a brief writer, the objective is to do the best job you can with all of those components of the brief, because it's like spinning a roulette wheel. Like you don't know the word that's going to trigger the creative thought. And so being really precise with all of the brief, I think is something at least I strive for. We talk a lot about target descriptions. You know, a lot of time if you can make a really good evocative target description that the creatives can feel, that can go a long way. And maybe they don't even pay attention to the single-minded proposition. Like it becomes and also something that our listeners are probably tired of hearing me say is, you know, this is a iterative and organic process, this thing of creativity.
Sure,
so
sure.
so
Yeah.
so what I start out with as a strategist, as a direction, I might have to pivot based on that first round of creative that I see, because they might have hit on an insight or on a way of looking at the problem that I hadn't contemplated when I was writing my drafts of the brief the first time. So I always say, you know, don't be married to the strategy. Like if you see something better, latch onto it and don't be afraid to pivot.
And it can be iterative, right? I mean, like, you know, at Mad Dog's an Englishman, right? So from Chiat, I went to Mad Dogs. That was Nick and I wound up having a 6-hour conversation in a sushi bar, and then we did that thing. And I would often kind of say there, I knew the creatives I was working with, and I knew the kind of creative that we wanted to make, right? I knew what we wanted to make, and I knew that it didn't just have to be right, it had to be ours, it had to be Mad Dogs. And very often it's like a brief would get us to a good idea, and then that good idea could become the brief.
Yep.
Make more that's like that.
I think that happens a lot in new business. Honestly, I think you start out with whatever information is made available by the client, and whatever you can get, you got to brief really quickly, right? Because normally the times to, but then in the process of evaluating creative, you start modifying and tailoring the strategy back to the creative that came back. And I think everybody just generally feels freer in a pitch situation because of the nature of a pitch. I definitely see.
Because they're probably not getting paid.
Well, and you don't have all of
Or rather,
the
the agency isn't getting paid.
yeah, the agency's not getting paid, but also you don't have all of the kind of self-censorship, because you don't know all of the things you're not supposed to say, or the things that are assumed that the client is. So you're kind of that, a little bit of that naivete helps in a pitch situation.
Yeah,
When you work with a client for a long time, I think one of the dangers of working with a client for a long time is that you start to say, well, they're never going to buy that, or that, you know what I mean? Like you start like putting yourself in a box.
right.
That generally isn't the case in a pitch.
But when I talk to people about developing strategy, when I do like workshops and stuff like that, I people can get very confused by a brief, especially in these days of technology, right? A lot of people who are sort of new to things, they sort of think it's like a flow chart. You know what I mean? Like that the thing that goes up at the front affects what happens next, which, like somehow you poop out a strategy at the bottom, actually sort of run through the flow chart. And I encourage people to think about it more organically. And one way that I do that is if you do an intersection of 3 circles, which are an insight into your context, your category, or your objective, right? What you want to achieve in your category, an insight into your audience, and something about your brand. And you put those circles in an overlap. What do they have in common? That's usually a pretty darn good brief.
Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or at least a good start. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can work in circles, right? Because it's like, all right, I can thinking about the Coke Pepsi thing, right? It's like Pepsi's newer than Coke, although these days, that's long gone. But, when Pepsi was choice of a new generation, Pepsi's newer than Coke. Coke is established. Pepsi is sweeter. Young people like sweet stuff. Choice of a new generation, pop culture anthems.
Celebrity versus, tradition.
Yep. It's a
th-
brand, and as
yeah,
Howard said, it's a branding thing, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
so let's use this little segue we've already made. You're now at Mad Dogs. You were hired again to start a planning department. You were a
Yeah,
one.
I mean, I was brought in as Nick's partner, and so we were running it together and but
Okay.
we were planning forward. I think I was the second planner principal, the first being Adam Stagliano, and I was 30.
And okay. And you said to me when we met in Toronto, you said that you were one of the original American account planners. So you were a pioneer in this field, which no one calls themselves an account planner anymore. We're now strategists. So, that's what John Steele said when we were talking to him. Let's take a look. You have a perspective that very few people have. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what has changed since you were an original account planner. What stayed the same? Have the briefs changed? If they haven't, should they? What is the evolution of this practice that you've seen since the beginning?
It feels as though the whole world of marketing and advertising has changed a lot, right? There's a lot of sort of silos of different ways of marketing. Sort of social media marketing or celebrity marketing, it's almost always exactly the same strategy for everything. It's just choosing the right person, or the right look. I'm very intrigued, though, by the way that brand narratives have become more like fashion narratives, how they evolve so quickly. So certainly that's really changed. When you kind of think of more of like the kind of advertising, I mean, we all kind of cut our teeth on TV advertising being an important big thing. And interesting, I mean, there's still TV advertising, right? But it's mostly being fed to you algorithmically, right? So you're no longer, if you're seeing TV advertising, it's usually being fed because they know it's you versus because it fits this show. So that's a whole new thing, right? That the environment of where the advertising is actually being showing up is it's no longer a shared environment. I mean, that's part of why I think the Super Bowl advertising is still really important to people. It's because it's one of the few kind of
Water
shared,
cooler events that
yeah, a
everybody
cultural
gathers around
experience.
it, and
Yeah.
And everybody
And
loves
people
to
care
poo-poo
about
it
the
because
ad.
it's not as good.
It's not, well, it's not, I mean, there was always it was always a mix, and there are good things there. Feels like more often it feels like it's more sort of who has the biggest spectacle as opposed to who has the best idea.
Mhm.
But there's some good brands with some pretty good discipline and some pretty good briefs, and or you can kind of feel it, in the background of that. So I think part of what's really changed is that a lot of, what used to be called we were called account planners, right? And we worked with media planners, right? And media planners found people, right? And account planners found ideas.
we get together
And
they
these
shall meet.
yeah, and these
Um,
days a lot of strategy is around people, around channels. But I don't know, I still get a few opportunities, every quarter or so to write a creative brief for something that is something new it might be coming from a consultant as opposed to an agency, although it also might be coming from an agency. Um, I drop in on a handful of agencies that, will sort of reach for somebody they can rely on occasionally. But it might be coming from a consultant who's helping somebody accomplish something, and is still looking for, like, I partly want to come forward with at least the beginning of a strategy. So I think some pieces of it are the same, but the outputs are so different, right? And the outputs, because they're so fragmented around audiences and around buying towards audiences through these methods that target us directly. I think you wind up with people who are real specialists for particular targets, and for that matter, specialists for particular formats, for particular media resources. Um, and I see a lot fewer good big ideas, you
Mhm.
know.
I suspect, and I could certainly be wrong. I allow for the fact that I could be wrong, but I suspect that there's going to be a pendulum shift back toward not micro targeting so much. That the promise of micro targeting probably hasn't paid the dividends that everybody thought it was going to pay, and that maybe for at least for big brands, it would make sense to really, and I think that Byron Sharp and others are like proponents of that. It's like you go
Uh-huh.
after all category buyers, right? And 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 that's really the most efficient way. And I suspect that we're going to see more of that. Now, I think what the internet and social media and all this stuff has done is that it's created that long tail, right? There's a lot of niche companies that can be born and target a very specific niche audience. And so like one of the example I always give is I have a sailboat, and that's an activity that at one time in the United States was pretty popular, but like it's kind of declined in popularity. And so, but there's still people that do it, and it's a very specialized thing. And so, targeting everybody doesn't make sense if you make like winches and foul weather gear for sailors.
Right, right, yeah.
But um most of the big brands we know aren't that specialized, right? Like they're really for more mass audiences. So I think it's definitely an interesting time. I also feel that because of the rapid change of the technology and how people are receiving their entertainment, I'm going to call it entertainment instead of content, because content to me sounds sterile and boring, and it feels like generic, like content, like I'm consuming I'm looking for entertainment, like I'm, you know, looking for videos that are funny or whatever it is. And I think that we're still in the wild west of figuring out like what the law of the land is, and we have all these vendors and all, promising that this is the way it is or the way it's going to be. And I just see that things are changing so rapidly that the dust hasn't even settled yet. Like we're still finding our way with a lot of these media.
Yeah, well, and media is changing all the time these days. It just is. And it's partly, that's partly just a business reality. I've worked with tons and tons of media companies. It's been one of my specialties, and my company specialties. We've worked with a bunch of cable companies. We've worked with a number of websites. We've bunch of media companies. We've worked with a lot of publishers. And there is so much going on now in like the world of streaming where it's just, mergers, 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 mergers. We hear that peak TV is no longer, it'll probably be back, but there's a lot of folks in media companies that are sort of sitting around waiting to get fired. And a lot of realization on the part of media companies that having a library of old content, because that's part of things too, right? Is like there's not, the level of currency isn't as high, but having a library of old content can be what you live on for a good long while without necessarily coming up with new concepts.
Especially, unfortunately, when the new stuff doesn't seem as interesting or creative as a lot of the old stuff. In fact, a lot of the new stuff is just old stuff repackaged. It
Yeah, I mean,
seems.
and although there's always a few things that, people are kind of hot on being part of knowing it, being part of seeing it, that sort of thing. I was reading like and movie theaters, right? Movies have changed a lot when, with strikes, with COVID, that whole industry. My husband is a film editor. That whole industry went into the shitter, but it seems kind of to be finding its way, via superheroes and horror. Horror is
Hopefully we'll
not
find
as much of the pie as it used to be.
some new subject matter soon for the
Yeah, new
cinema,
heroes and
because
new horror.
I love the cinema, but I just, a lot of what's on offer these days just personally is not,
Well, we're not
superhero
14
movies are.
years old anymore, Henry. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, although, one thing you can do now in a movie theater, you can go in there, you can buy a drink, you can take it
yeah.
with you can get a meal, I
You
mean,
can recline and fall asleep rather than doing that at home.
and I think part of why horror is, and I'm not a horror fan personally because I am
Me
too
neither.
imaginative. It gets into my head and stays there, so that's why I'm not a horror
Hmm.
fan. But I get why people care about it a lot. It's partly like you live in a scary world. It's good to be scared in a way that's safe. But it's also, I think, for movie theaters, right? That's a thing that um it's fun to be with a group of people in the dark.
Community, yeah, in the yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't figured that out yet. The last horror movie I saw was Alien, the original Alien.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Well, that's
You
Yeah.
know,
more
That's
thriller,
wild.
well, it
suspense,
scared the
science,
hell out of me.
sci-fi.
I
Yeah,
know it
it's
scared the hell
scary,
out of me.
but
It was like Jaws in outer space, you know?
yeah.
I saw a documentary recently with Steven Spielberg, and he looks back on that and says, "Thank God the shark didn't work, because otherwise the movie wouldn't have been nearly as scary.
Right.
If it had
Yeah.
done the things they wanted it to do originally, it wouldn't have been scary. The scary part about the movie was that you didn't see the shark. Anyway, speaking about what you don't see, well, I don't know if that's a segue or not, but I'm really curious. I'm really curious. You know, my thing is teaching brief writing, but from the creative perspective. What is it that a creative wants? So it's uniquely different from the way you would teach it. Although I think we try to arrive at the same kind of conclusion about clarity and inspiration. I know, as I said this in Toronto, people ask me, "What's your favorite brief?" And I say, I don't write them. I read them.
Uh-huh.
You, like Henry, have written many, many briefs, and you've been doing it over a long period of time. From your perspective as a brief writer, I mean, have you ever looked back on some of your original briefs and what do you think about how you have evolved as a brief writer? What has been something that you noticed about the quality of your briefs over the years?
Well, certainly the client will make a difference, right? That's one thing. Like when I look back at my briefs, my Mad Dogs briefs, um, and for that matter, my staff's Mad Dogs briefs, I had some great planners who worked for me and with me along the way as well, and who have gone on to great things. There's something about when you're a club that you kind of know what you're about as a club, right? We were not going to be, we would pitch a lot of stuff, but we knew we were never going to be the agency for everything. We're called Mad Dogs and Englishmen, for God's sake. And we would put on our briefs, there was a picture of a sad looking little dog in the corner, one with the long ears. Speaking of which, my dogs are asleep here. Let's take a look at them there. There they are. And I would say to the clients when we sent a brief over, part of why we put the dog, and by the way, we put a ravenous dog on our invoices.
Very
But
subtle.
but the sad little dog, the sort of Beagle Basset kind of dog, I would say to clients when we first started working with them, this is what our briefs are going to look like. I just want you to know that they're probably different than other agencies that you've worked with. And we put the silly dog on our briefs to remind you that this is not a legal contract. This is a creative tool.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we'd have that speech sort of up front. And the briefs are very spare. The Mad Dogs briefs are super spare. That was our style. We'd get our description of our audience down to a handful of words, we'd get our tonality down to a handful of words, we'd get the center to a handful of words. And our brief forms, kind of like the circles, had a relationship between the core idea, an audience insight. We would have described the audience in such a way that would help the media planner, but we'd have one tiny little audience insight and one brand insight with an arrow pointing to the box in which the strategic focus was, because that was another piece of our brand and our concept and our shared, as a club,
Yeah, I call it a black box methodology. That was the way you guys looked at the brief.
Yeah.
This is how we construct it, how we think of it logically. But I love the dog as a disclaimer that it's not a legal contract, because to me, one of the biggest challenges, and that's why, we joke, like the genesis of this podcast was an argument Howard and I had about co-collaborating a creative brief with a client. And I said, it sounds all wonderful in theory, but the reality is that clients want to litigate creative briefs. And they want to, they're going to want to dump a bunch of stuff. And I said, let them give us their version of a brief, and then let us, the agency, internalize it and use our black box methodology, the way we think about it, as part of our first step of our creative approach, rather than the last step of the order taking approach.
Right.
And so, but I love that, the idea of like, this is not a legal contract. Like they spend way too much time parsing words instead of, like I say, the way you evaluate a creative brief, if you're a client and you're asking to see them ahead of time, is, do I generally feel comfortable with this direction? Forget about like all the parsing of the words, and we're like, does this feel like a direction I want to go on? And if it makes me uncomfortable, let's talk about it, right? That doesn't mean the agency caves in, but it's way too much like looking at it with a magnifying glass and say, can you change the word to that word? It's like, come on.
So when you sent the brief over, Robin, did you expect to have a dialogue? Or was this, how did that work for you?
I would expect to have a dialogue with the client, and I would have already had a dialogue with my partner, with Nick. We would have been clear. We would have been connected on that stuff. And, I'd make changes if I needed to, or, my staff would make changes if needed. But not much. And so the briefs that I've written over the years, I will conform to whatever the form is that I'm being asked to use. So if I'm, working with an agency or a consultant that has a specific format, I'll use their format, right? But in my own mind, when I sit down and start, I'm like, I kind of need three things to point into this center.
Well,
Well, I've had this.
the beautiful thing is that generally all brief formats have some way of containing those important things, right? We call them different things. We label each box a little bit differently, whatever. And an agency might have it's in this order versus, but essentially all, brief formats have common elements. And if you're an experienced strategist like you are, you can take your way of thinking and say, oh, I understand. If what they're doing is understandable, I can translate it into that format.
Also, in some of my workshops, I've made the point that the strategy is liquid. The brief format is the bottle. You pour it into the bottle.
And the bottle
might be different somewhere else, but the liquid. Yeah.
And I've done enough workshops where I've heard the marketers tell me, well, we need to fix our creative brief template. There's something wrong with our template. I say, well, there's probably nothing wrong with your template. The problem is the answers, is the content.
But there might be something wrong with their template because
I've never seen a template. I've never seen a template that was, it was the answers.
But you can always improve a template.
Yeah, I've seen templates that ask the same question three different ways and expect three different answers, and then they therefore don't have a single-minded brief.
Yeah,
I've seen that.
Good point.
Yeah.
I think and there's ways that you could make a question more evocative that's more likely to get a better quality response. But again, usually if you have a good strategist, the template isn't going to matter that much, right? Like they're going to find a way to give a good quality content to that brief. And Howard teaches a lot of clients, right? So
right.
And I think that one of the things that either account people when they're pressed to write briefs, or maybe even junior strategists or planners or clients, is not giving the care and love to a brief that it merits, right? Like that it's a form that I have to fill out. And a form is like the least creative thing possible, right? Like a form is just something that like I need. If you go to the DMV, you have to fill out a form, right? Like I have to give this information so that I can get what I need. But there's, a brief is really about the answers, not the questions.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think it would also be true to say, I just, just as somebody who's, had an agency, I put this out there, that part of what you're doing with the brief, at least when you're within an agency environment, is you're managing workflow. It's like, you've got creatives working on something, they're going to need to be working on something else. There is a certain thing about just creating a gate that you go through where you have a client moment and you have not yet engaged your creative teams other than to, perhaps get their first thoughts.
No, there's absolutely a practical.
Yeah, there's some practical reason for
there's a
brief.
practical reason for the brief to exist, but I think that's the bare minimum. That's the bare minimum of what a brief does, right?
Sure. And yeah.
Yeah, and speaking for creatives, I have seen everything from no brief at all to 15 pages where I had to go wading into the muck and figure out what the point was, what the problem was. And I can say, speaking for all creatives, we'll solve the problem no matter what you give us. Even if we have to go with nothing, we will figure it out, because the instinct, our DNA is built around, we want to solve the problem. Now, I'd rather have that tight brief that David Ogilvy talks about. I'd rather have that one sentence that Sir John Hegarty talks about. I don't agree with Bob Hoffman, who says every brief should make us famous, although I get his point. I can't work with a brief that just says make us famous. I'm going to say, okay, now let's talk about the specifics. Give me some meat about how to make you famous. So creatives will solve the problem. And,
Yeah, and also
we've-
that's back again, that's back to objectives, right? Sometimes that's not the right objective. Sometimes it's just not.
well,
It used to
yeah,
be. Yeah, that probably used to almost always be the right objective, but not anymore.
yeah.
Sometimes being the inside, lane that other people don't know about, the world's best secret or whatever, so that could be good too. Yeah.
So
And
what?
I make a very when I say I'll work with a whatever form, but I try very hard to say, can we get this to one page? Because what
Yeah.
I find with creatives is that's what goes up on the desk, and page 15 does not get consulted.
Unless the thing that's most important is
answer.
on page 15. Yeah.
In which case,
But
page
don't
does not.
don't make me dig through 14 pages to find it. I mean, I'll do it because it's like, come on, where is it? And I know what I'm looking for. Although, some creatives say, I just looking for the insight. I look for the single-minded proposition. I don't not read the brief. I always read the whole brief, but I'm looking for one thing. But as Henry said, and as you have said, maybe that's the target audience. Maybe it's the objective. Maybe it's some kind of brand statement that sparks my imagination. Whatever it is, I'll find it. And if I can't find it, I'll do like this guy who went to the plant and discovered the Capodastro bar. I'll find something. And, as Henry has said on many occasions, he has submitted a brief to his creative team, and they've gone off and said, sorry, Henry, we found a better way. And Henry said, you know what? I have to be humble. I have to say that idea is better than what my brief was pointing at, and I will rewrite the brief. Doesn't happen often, but
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
pretty
Yeah.
frequently. I mean, enough to make it memorable. Yeah.
right. All right. So Robin, this fascinating discussion. You've done a lot of work. I'm a junior strategist. Let's just say I'm a junior strategist. I'm just starting out. What advice would you give me? I come to you and say, Robin, help me out. Well, what advice would you give me?
Okay, a junior strategist just starting out. I would say to look at some of the writing about strategy before the messy, confusing media environment we're in now. Because there would be, for instance, John Steele's book, there'd be a lot to be learned there. I'll do a little plug here for my partner Nick Cohen's book, which is available on Amazon. It's called Honest, a true story of a ridiculous attempt to make advertising more truthful. It's a beautiful little volume, and you can find it on Amazon and on Kindle. So I'll make a plug for that. For you just mentioned some old stars in the strategy world. So I would say look not just at this time and place, but look backward a bit, and because you can see some of the purity there, that might get really sort of hidden by just how the media environment, the complexity of that sort of thing is. So that's one thing I'd say. I'd say know your target audience. I have a research and strategy company, and so my first business that I was a principal of was an advertising agency. My second business was a brand consultancy, and my current business is primarily it's research and strategic research, basically a research consultancy. So I've sort of in my own career moved closer to the people, as it were. And my side gig is spiritual counseling, which is even closer to the people when you get down to it. So I would say really know your target audience, and don't assume there's a lot of, and AI is even doing this now. Like, there are now AI panels that are built around the avatars that brands have created for their supposed target audiences. And I have never seen a brand avatar that wasn't 97% BS. Total crap. So what then you're building, and I'm not saying that I'm not using AI myself, I am, but what you're building then is a focus group of people who are not people, who you have imagined based on your own imagination about who you think your target is, which is already dumb. And now you're going to invent them so that they can talk to you and tell you more dumb stuff that they're pulling from the past.
Now, don't pull back on us, Robin. Tell us what you really think.
I think, you know, I still think, you know, it's like understand human beings, know the human beings that you're trying, know the human beings that you're trying to
Yeah.
connect with, you know, because the strategist to some degree is the in-between point, the pivot point between those human beings and the human beings who are in the creative department, who are trying to talk to those human beings, you know, to connect with those human beings, to get those human beings. So that's, I would certainly give advice around understanding target audiences, and that would include, you know, don't be afraid of data.
Mm.
Don't be afraid to, you know, get out there and ask people questions. You know, don't be intimidated by numbers. You know, just, you know, be in a position to be able to understand what's going on. I would also say listen to your clients and understand their aspirations. You know, because sometimes they're in a similar way. Sometimes when, you know, make me famous, right? That's one kind of client aspiration. Sometimes one with you can kind of work it out that there are 5 or 6 different ways that this particular product they could sell more stuff. But what is the client's aspiration? You know, because that often is really important. And if what the client wants is a case study that's going to get them the next most fabulous job ever, that is probably a little bit different than what the client wants is they want the family business that they've had forever to continue to stand for something that is really important to them, but to do so in such a way
Yep.
that it connects with modern people. Right. So I think you know, some of my advice to incoming strategists would be around um, you know, just being good listeners to
Mm.
human,
Mhm.
because you're
Who would you
taking
point to? Who would you
it.
point to as doing a good job now? Which brand? If I'm this junior strategist and you say study this brand, which one, I say which brand should I study? Which one would you point to?
I'm still really liking the Johnny Walker campaign. I think that's
Mm.
really smart.
The
Um,
rebranding effort,
the
which
the
is
keep
quite.
the
Yeah,
keep
well, the
walk.
keep
Oh, if
because
they
I
know,
think
you know,
BBH rebranded, I don't know,
uh,
15, 20 years ago, and they literally changed the direction of the guy. Johnny Walker was facing the other way, and they just turned him
Yeah.
around.
Yes. They
But
when
that's like,
when they came up with the idea of making the striding man character an avatar of
of,
personal
of moving through the world. Yeah.
personal progress,
Yeah. Yeah.
they realize, well, he's walking right to left, which is not the way in Western culture we generally see movement forward.
Moving
So
forward.
they actually just mirror imaged him, and now he walks left to right.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's, yeah, I think that's actually really kind of great branding.
and it's
Um,
so subtle but critical.
but so critical. Yeah. I think you know, the insurance, there's so much branding going on in the insurance category. You know, and that's, I think that I kind of, that used to be a category that just was not driven by, you know, TV, by, it wasn't driven by recency, by the recency of you seeing something, but it is
Mhm.
now. I think there's actually some like 4 really good strong brands that are all really good there. And then they're in a, you know, Geico changes, you know, they're doing different things all the time. But I think those are some good brands. I don't know. Those are some that pop to mind. If you name some that you like, I'll tell you whether I like them.
Well, let's go back. Target, made
Oh, sure.
retail design a
Yeah.
thing, and but that's ancient. I mean, that's been around for what, 20, 25 years when they
Yeah, that's
rebranded.
that's ancient, and they're no longer really doing it.
No.
I would say that in the vein of that, you know, like people kind of love to hate Amazon, but they're completely addicted to it, so they use it.
Yeah.
As you know,
Lucky Generals is doing some good
but
work.
but when I'll tell you, when I see on a truck, you know, I think some of the best ad work I see lately is out of home.
Mm.
And when I see on a truck, there's a whole lot more to Amazon, a truckload more.
Yeah.
It always makes me smile. It always makes me feel better, a little bit better about Amazon. I think that's actually really smart branding. Um, yeah, so
What do you think of Nike's uh most recent work with uh, uh winners aren't afraid to win? I'm not
yeah,
giving it
yeah.
justice.
Yeah, it's kind of a, are you a bad person?
Are
It's the
you a
sort
bad
of, are
person?
you a
Yeah.
bad person because you want to win? Um,
Is
I
that on
don't,
brand?
I don't think it's their best, to be honest. I think it's provocative though, but I think Nike is a brand where from the perspective of what Nike needs to be as a brand, the shoe category these days is so driven by drops. It's so driven by a fast fashion kind of movement and a certain kind of desire, sort of social media driven, kind of engaged desire around having the thing, the right thing at the right moment. Um, that I think the undercurrent, the underbridge of that brand of just do it, um, still very, very relevant, and still very particularly relevant for the stuff that's going to sell at a lower price. But Nike, in order to battle with the style stuff, of course, they've got to some of what they've got to do with it is they've just got to attach themselves to the virality of the Olympics and to those people as stars. So I don't, it doesn't move my heart, but I bet it moves shoes.
Put
Yeah.
on your prognosticating, pull out your crystal ball. What do you see in the next few years for strategy and for our industry? Good, bad, or indifferent?
Okay. Well, for the advertising and marketing industry, I'm really intrigued, and I think that Henry might be right that we might see a return to some kinds of mass ways of communicating. With the loss of the water cooler means that when you wear something or buy something, the only people who know what you mean by that, right, are a very small crew. And that probably is bad for brands. Um, I think that what I call upside down branding is going to continue to be the trend. So, where it used to be sort of a brand message that would sort of work its way down to people, upside down branding is more that it works its way up through people. I still think that's going to be important. So I think influencers are going to be important, but I think influencer marketing is going to go through some massive shifts because it's become overused. It's too much. People don't believe each other anymore. It doesn't feel authentic anymore. So I think that'll go through some real shifts. Um, I think sound branding is going to continue to be an important thing. The use of sounds to sort of distinguish brands, not just their visual, their visual look and feel, but also how they sound. I think that'll keep being important. Um, Podcasting is one of the few media categories that is really growing, and here you are in it, right, at a really, really strong rate. People are walking around with something in their ears at all times, so I think that's going to be interesting. I wonder if brands are going to continue to sort of divide into red and blue brands. Our nation is so polarized, and we're polarized around a sort of, a political construct. We're also polarized in part because we're living in to some degree, separate media universities, not universities, universes, but they're universities too, right? Because they're teaching us how to think. And within those media universes, I mean, sure, everybody's watching some part of everybody's watching 2.5 Men at the end of the day, like they're kind of falling asleep or whatever. But the ads they're receiving are being really given to them. I'm sort of wondering if that's going to continue or whether there might be some movement back towards, some shared ideals.
I'm old
Um,
fashioned. I liked it better when big brands stayed the hell out of politics and the culture war and all of that, and just stick to selling beer, or stick, you know what I mean.
Sure, but selling beer also means sell at beer selling opportunities. And so beer selling opportunities include both Pride Month and, you know, uh, football,
I don't
you know,
disagree with
stuff.
that from a media kind of standpoint. I'm talking more from a creative messaging, like taking sides on an issue,
Yeah, well, and
particularly
I
one
think
where the
both
country's 50-50.
sure. I think most brands would say that that's not what they're doing, but but they are coming out with a pride pack. You know what I mean? And then it's like, okay, then some dude sees that in Target and loses his mind. And some crazy thing is born. But yeah, so I'm curious as to whether we'll emerge back together. We have a real age divide around some of that stuff. At this point, 35% of young women are identifying as non-binary. You know,
For how
that's
long?
exactly, who knows? I don't know. I mean, you know,
And at
when
what
I
age, when you say young woman, I mean, I've read enough statistics to know that, when they're in their young teen years, they will grow out of that. They will change, they will recognize that this is not really what they're feeling.
I mean millennial plus Z.
Okay.
So we're getting up into the 30s there. You know, will that change? I don't know. But that's but you know, that's not a culture war issue. That's just a culture issue. You know, so it's just something to take on board that, you know, so for instance, from a branding perspective, one of the things that I think really is going to change, and it should, and it will, and it's kind of interesting to think about, is how to define beauty, how to define femininity, you know, how to define feeling really, really good you know, with what you're wearing. And you know, I think those things will keep shifting, and that'll be really interesting.
Defining masculinity.
Similar, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, you know, part of the, you know, I think for guys, you know, I used to do, I gave it up because I could never make a profit on it, but we had a tracker, a youth tracker for a number of years at Open Mind. And part of what we could see among young men was just like, how am I supposed to behave? I don't quite get it anymore, you know? Like, you know, which, you know, some run off into incel territory, some,
Mm.
you know, become really empathetic, but it's like, how am I supposed to be in order to get the things that I want, which include women?
Well, lots to think about, and we, definitely appreciate your insights. So, Robin Hafitz, founder of Open Minds Strategy.
Mhm.
Is that Open Mind Strategy and Research?
It's Open Mind Strategy LLC, and yep, that's
And
found.
one of the pioneers of account planning and strategy in the United States. Thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers. We appreciate
Thank
you
you
being
very
here.
much.
You're so welcome, and I'm glad somebody cares about this stuff so much and is.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye bye.